So good evening, dear beloved community. It's so wonderful to be together on this, the 17th day of January in the year 2021. Against all odds, we've made it to this day, and that's something indeed to celebrate. I hope that you're well wherever you might find yourself at this moment in time. In the last talk that I gave 2 weeks ago, I offered a reflection question on amama, which means not mine. It was a different way of approaching the usual teaching of non-self, to approach it in terms of reflecting throughout our lives on when we're creating something in terms of mine, and to see what it is that we're calling ours. I wonder how you did with that practice. When we consider the founders of various spiritual traditions, the Buddha is quite unique, since he never claimed to be anything other than human. There's a story that very soon after his enlightenment, the Buddha was walking mindfully along a road, and he passed by a villager, and the villager was struck by the Buddha's extraordinary and peaceful presence. The villager asked, "Friend, what are you? Are you a celestial being or a god?" And the Buddha said, "No." And then the villager asked again, "Well, are you some kind of magician, or are you some kind of wizard?" And the Buddha said, "No." Then the villager said, "Well, what then are you?" And the Buddha replied, "I'm awake." The Buddha also didn't claim any divine inspiration, but he always emphasized that it was possible for each one of us to awaken, just like he did. In fact, he repeatedly shared something that goes against our usual views of spirituality. He shared that the very best place of practice, the place of real transformation of heart, is not in the heavenly realms or any other plane of existence, but right here in the human realm. That rather than transcendence, floating on clouds and so forth, our real path is transformation right here and right now, in whichever circumstance we find ourselves. In the Book of Eights, which are considered as some of the earliest teachings of the Buddha, we meet the Buddha as a human being, and he's offering practical teachings to be applied immediately. In each of the poems, we're reminded of the core teaching of the Buddha that many of us have forgotten. That Buddhas merely point out the way, and we have to walk it for ourselves. 2 years ago, when I was visiting the Institute of Higher Buddhist Studies in Sarnath, which is a Tibetan educational institution, I had the opportunity to spend some time sitting in the courtyard watching the traditional monastic debates. It was really something quite spectacular. In the Tibetan system, there are even certain physical postures and gestures to be made depending on each point. Sometimes brandishing our mala, our rosary, or clapping the hands in a particular way to punctuate the point that we're making. It's really something to see. If ever you have a chance to watch a monastic debate, please take that opportunity. As I was watching those debates, I was reminded that in ancient India, there was a strong cultural tradition of philosophical speculation and debate. In the Pali Canon, from this background, we find many instances of people coming to debate their views with the Buddha. One commentary on tonight's poem, which is poem number 8 in the Atthakavagga, in the Book of Eights, it's kind of auspicious, introduces us to a mendicant Pasura who came to the Buddha intending to debate the Buddha's teaching. And this poem is the Buddha's response to Pasura the mendicant, and it's actually called the Pasura Sutta, or the Discourse to Pasura. One of the major themes in the Book of Eights is non-dualism, transcending or transforming our tendency to get caught on one side or another, one extreme or another, good and bad, this and that, being and non-being, Dharma and non-Dharma, true or false, practice or non-practice. In 2004, I was having tea with Tay, and as we were sitting drinking tea, he turned to me and said, "You know what, Brother Papai? There's a deep teaching in Buddhism that if we're truly attentive, there's nothing that's not the Dharma." We find this profound teaching on non-dualism in one of its most profound and expansive forms in the Diamond Sutra. The Diamond Sutra, which is in the form of a dialogue between the Buddha and his senior disciple, Subhuti, presents this question that's offered by Subhuti. If children of good families want to give rise to the highest, most fulfilled, awakened mind, what should they rely on, and what should they do to master their thinking? And in the Diamond Sutra, the Buddha says, they're not caught in the idea of a Dharma or the idea of a non-Dharma. They're not caught in the notion that this is a sign and that's not a sign. Why? If you're caught in the idea of a Dharma, you're also caught in the ideas of a self, a person, a living being, or a lifespan. If you're caught in the idea that there's no Dharma, you're still caught in the ideas of a self, a person, a living being, and a lifespan. This is why we should not get caught in Dharmas or in the idea that Dharmas don't exist. This is the hidden meaning when the Tathagata, the Buddha, says, "You should know that all of the teachings I give to you are a raft. All teachings must be abandoned, not to mention non-teachings." These four notions, a self, a person, a living being, and a lifespan, are all notions that can trap us and that do not express the liberating insight of Buddhism. They're not the only notions that we can get caught in, of course, but they're four big ones. In the Diamond Sutra, we're reminded that if we're still caught in the idea of a self, if we're still caught in the idea of a person, a living being, or a lifespan, then according to the wisdom of the Diamond Sutra, then we're not an authentic bodhisattva. It's also interesting to contemplate here something that not many commentators mention. In fact, a lot of people shy away from. In the above line, if you are still caught in these four notions, you're not an authentic bodhisattva, there's a seeming paradox. On the one hand, we have this deeply penetrating understanding of non-duality in the ultimate sense. But at the same time, in expressing this insight in terms such as authentic and non-authentic, then we're using terms that clearly belong to the relative, the conventional realm. Since the idea of authentic and non-authentic appear to be opposite, they appear to be in opposition to each other. Insight is insight. But any expression of insight by its very nature needs to come through conventional designation and be somewhat limited. If it's shared with words, then it's coming through conventional designation and it'll be somewhat limited. So as you come into contact with these profound and wonderful teachings, please be aware that even though we're talking about non-dualism, we're talking about not getting caught in pairs of opposites, of transcending and transforming the notion of this and that even with that as that insight as a background, oftentimes the teaching can still be presented in a way that may appear that there are pairs of opposites, such as an authentic bodhisattva and a not authentic bodhisattva. Let's enjoy a sound of the bell. Self, person, living being, and lifespan are four individual and collective notions that prevent us from seeing and knowing reality as it is. Not seeing the interconnected nature of all things, we find it convenient to compartmentalize. In fact, the thing that we call a self, I, me, or mine, actually consists only of non-self elements, to use the insight of Buddhism. When we look at a flower, for example, and our teacher Tay has given us this example so many times, we think that this flower is separate from whatever we call a non-flower. But if we look more deeply, we take the flower as the object of our contemplation, sooner or later we'll see that every single thing is contained in that flower. Without all the elements that we call non-flower elements, sunshine, clouds, earth, minerals, heat, rivers, and consciousness, which are constantly in a state of change, a flower can't come to be. The same is true for what we call the self. This is why the Buddha teaches the self doesn't exist. So this, in general, in a very basic way, is the first notion. The second notion that prevents us from touching reality as it is the notion of a person, a human being. We have a tendency to discriminate between humans and what we call non-humans, thinking that humans are more important than other species. But since we humans are also made only of non-human elements, to protect ourselves, we have to protect all the non-human elements. When we recognize that we inter-are with all that is, we see that to take care of the so-called non-human elements, the environment, for example, is to take care of our very own body. The third notion mentioned in the Diamond Sutra that we're invited to look into is the notion of a living being. We think that we living beings are somehow different from what we call inanimate objects. But according, again, to the principle of interbeing and non-self, living beings are comprised of non-living being elements. If we look deeply into ourselves, it's not too difficult to see the minerals and all the other so-called non-living being elements. What is it that leads us to believe that some things are inanimate? Atoms, electrons, and so forth are always moving, in some cases nearly at the speed of light. And also, according to the teaching of the Buddha, consciousness is contained everywhere. And the last notion mentioned in the Diamond Sutra for us to look into is that of a lifespan. We have this idea that we've been alive only since a fixed moment in time, which we call our birthday. And that prior to that moment, we didn't exist. But if we've looked deeply, we understand that something cannot come from nothing, just like something cannot become nothing. All of the atoms and elements that make up our bodies have been circulating in different formations for a very long time. And they'll continue a very long time after our so-called death. So it seems that the distinction between life and non-life is not so clear-cut. Life is made of death, and death is made of life. In fact, it's death that makes life possible. The cells in our body are dying every second, and the death of each cell allows for the birth of another. So life and death are two aspects of the same reality. Also, when we consider birth or death, we consider them from the position that there's one being that we call us, that's also fixed in time and space. We're continuing in so many ways, even in this very moment, through body, speech, and mind. To take just one small example, you will discover many more in your own contemplations on this. There's the you that exists as a concept in your own mind. And honestly, nobody but you has ever encountered that exact being. Because there's the you that exists in other people's minds, your beloved one, your brothers, your sisters, your community, the person at the post office, and so on. There's those people have memories, they have perceptions, they have ideas about you, and so forth. There are actually thousands of you. So which one is the real you? Which is the unreal you? In fact, we're a multitude. I think it'd be very nice in the future to spend some time with the Diamond Sutra, wouldn't it? But for now, perhaps we can continue on with our series of some of the earliest recorded teachings of the Buddha from the Book of Eights, the Atthakavagga. By looking deeply at the earliest teachings, we touch and we understand the roots from which all of the later fruits and flowers of Buddhism emerge. So let's listen to this week's poem in its entirety. And then we'll go through again, looking at a few key verses and draw out a few of the main themes. So this is poem 8, and as we mentioned before, the title is the Pasura Sutta, or some people call it Pasura the Debater. Different people settle for different versions of the truth, saying that there's no purification to be found in other teachings, declaring whatever they depend on to be the best. They are entrenched in separate truths. Wanting to debate, they gather in assemblies and accuse each other of being a fool. Relying on others' authority, they debate and argue, claiming to be skilled. They wish only for praise, fearing the failure which leaves them downcast, furious at the jibes of others, trying to find out their weaknesses. When others find flaws in your argument and refute it, you lament and grieve, wailing, "They've defeated me." Even serious practitioners can quarrel like this, having ups and downs, elation and depression, as they win and lose. Therefore, refrain from disputes. There's no meaning in it at all, except the prize of praise. If you make your point and win, and the group praises your ideas, you laugh, swell up with pride. That pride and arrogance will bring you down, but you're still arrogant, swollen with conceit. Don't you see there's no point to dispute? The wise tell us that quarreling and purification don't mix. Just as a hero, fed upon the best food, might roar forth, running around, searching for a champion rival and opponent, but discovers there never was an opponent. When those holding on to rigid views and disputing proclaim, "This is the only truth," just tell them that there was never anyone here to argue with. Pasura, how could you find an opponent among those who have no opponents, who don't counter views with other views? Thinking about different ideas with your intellect has just confused you. Now you've met a wise one, and you can't escape the truth. So this is a very rich and profound teaching. It's a teaching that we could sit with for a very long time in our practice. We'll just cover a few of the key themes in this beautiful teaching this evening. So in verse 1, we read, different people settle for different versions of the truth, saying that there's no purification to be found in others' teachings. Declaring whatever they depend on to be the best, they are entrenched in separate truths. So there's a saying that we hear often lately: that person has settled for such and such a thing. Excuse me, a relationship, a job, a situation, and so on. When we hear that phrase, there's a sense that even though whatever they might have settled for may not be the best thing for them, out of fear of what might happen if they let go of this comfortable place, that person has given up the possibility for further growth and development, in a sense mistaking comfort for security. There is this sense in the first line: don't settle. Don't settle in your spiritual life. Don't settle down in that comfortable place. That would be a waste. We need to keep growing. We need to keep going deeper. And that's incredibly scary for many of us. In modern society, and particularly in the West, I've noticed something over the last 10 years or so. When we speak of the Dharma, which we take to mean the collection of teachings of the Buddha, we almost treat it as a thing in and of itself. We create a self out of it. The word Dharma can have many meanings, from the teaching of the Buddha, which is the sense that we normally hear Dharma spoken about, to phenomena, like every single thing is a Dharma. Earlier in the week, last week, I was spending some time with my doctor who's from India, and he's also a student of Sanskrit. I have very good karma that way. As he was treating me, we had a lovely discussion on the different meanings of the word Dharma. He reminded me that one of the deepest meanings of the word Dharma is your essential nature. To practice the Dharma, to practice your Dharma, means to discover and to return to your essential nature. In India, there's another sense of the Dharma that feels important to mention here. And that is the sense of a way of being or inhabiting in the world, a way of service, a way of seeing or delight or inspiration. We'll sometimes hear that such and such a thing, an occupation and so forth, is a person's Dharma. And I think that this sense of Dharma, merging this sense of Dharma with our usual conception of Dharma as a set of codified teachings would be very helpful for us. This sense of a way of being, a way of inhabiting our experience, can help us to be able to embody our practice into a moment by moment way of being, the air that we breathe, the space we move within, rather than a stale set of techniques that we slot into our busy lives whenever we can fit them in order to get something, whatever that something might be. I think that making the change from the Dharma as an object to my Dharma is an important one in helping us to be able to shift our tendency away from practice as a technique in order to get something that we think that we lack, into an embodied and deeply personal path that occurs in each and every moment, that's being revealed in each and every moment. In this verse, we also have a reminder of the theme in one of the earlier poems of our tendency, if we're not careful, attentive, questioning, and discerning, for the shadow side of our practice to be a form of entrenching ourselves deeper and deeper into our own habit energies and views, whatever those habit energies might be, or whatever those views might be. They're our comfortable places. They're our comfortable houses. So for some of us, these entrenchments might even be so deep that they seem like the trenches on the battlefields of the First World War. So this is where it's important to bring the energy of mindfulness and reflect back on the views, the positions, our habitual habit energies, and really consider whether they are leading in a direction of liberation, or whether they're leading in a direction deeper down into the trenches. Let's continue on with verse number 2. Wanting to debate, they gather in assemblies and accuse each other of being a fool, relying on somebody else's authority. They debate and argue, each claiming to be skilled. So in this verse, we're invited to root ourselves in our lived experience, as I've been repeating quite a few times this evening. There's such a tendency towards, I read such and such a thing in a book, or I saw it on YouTube, or I heard this teacher say, or Tay said such and such a thing, or goodness forbid, Brother Phap Hai said such and such a thing 4 years ago. In this verse, we're reminded of the teaching in Buddhism that ultimately what matters, the only thing that really matters, is our own transformation and insight, and sharing from that experiential place rather than quoting everyone else or relying on everyone else's authority or transformation or insight. To do what we most want to avoid doing, to turn our attention from the outside, from thinking that we need to gain all this knowledge, to do just one more retreat, to read 3 or 4 more books, to when we finish studying this and learning that and get that qualification, finally we'll have everything, all the tools that we need in order to understand our situation. The Buddha said you already have all the tools that you need. You already have the capacity. So in fact, Master Lin Chi, one of the greatest teachers of our tradition, the founder of Lin Chi of Rinzai Zen, said, stop running around like an orphan, come back and claim your true inheritance. That true inheritance is the insight, the wisdom that's always been there. Might be a little bit covered over, but it's always been there. So in this verse, we're given a very strong teaching to stop relying on others' authority, quoting others' wisdom, claiming others' wisdom as our own, and to turn our attention around to put into practice what the wise ones have taught, what the Buddha has taught, what our teacher Tay has asked us to do, to walk mindfully, to sit mindfully, to breathe mindfully, to look deeply into our anger, our sadness, our jealousy, to build a beloved community, and to share from that embodied experience within ourselves, the insight that arises when we turn our attention back around and recognize, to discover and recognize what's been there all along. It's much easier to quote other people's insight. As it's said in the Kalama Sutta, one of the key suttas in the Pali canon, it's when you yourselves know from your own experience that such and such a thing is a benefit, that you don't need somebody else to tell you. You know from your own experience. Some of you know that I have a musical background. I have a few different backgrounds, but one of the backgrounds is a musical background. I played the piano for many years. And if you're a musician, you'll know that it's necessary to learn to play the music as it's written, to play it exactly as it's written in the first stages. And if we get to that technical level where we can pick up a piece of music, look at the piece of music, understand the intention of the composer, and be able to replicate that technically perfectly every time, then we've done very well. There's many years work in that already. But to truly become an artist, at some point we need to move beyond just playing something in a technically perfect way. We need to make our interpretation based on how we're feeling, the room that we're in, the audience, what we wish to convey in that moment, and so on. And then we're an artist. Each time we allow that piece of music to go through us, we're in contact with the original intention of the composer, but we're also adding our own experience, our own insight, our embodiment to that piece. That's something that's living. That's something that is like a river, that we never touch the same water twice. The same is true in the spiritual life. There's imitation. And that's important. We need to learn the basics of the practice, and we do that best by imitating. But there also needs to be innovation. Letting the Dharma well up from within us once we have rooted ourselves deeply. Anything else would be a pity. Let's have a sound of the bell. Verse number 3 reads, "They wish only for praise, fearing the failure which leaves them downcast, furious at the jibes of others, trying to find out their weaknesses. When others find flaws in your argument and refute it, you lament and grieve, wailing, 'They've defeated me.'" Oh, praise and blame. In Buddhism, we speak about 8 winds, winds that blow from within our human heart and mind, and that can swirl us around in 1,000 directions and blind us, and that in a very deep sense actually run the world. There's an insight in Buddhism that all worldly situations arise from these internal and external winds, which are 4 pairs of opposites. They're actually called the 8 worldly dharmas. Sometimes you'll hear them referred to as the 8 winds, but other times you'll hear them referred to as the 8 worldly dharmas. And to carry on from our earlier discussion, these are 8 worldly mindsets or ways of being that are far from the Dharma with a capital D. Come to think of it, Dharma with a capital D would be a good title for a book, wouldn't it? Each of these 8 worldly dharmas or 8 winds doesn't really need much of an explanation, since honestly, they're quite familiar to most of us. In them, we live, we move, and we have our being. The first pair of winds, the first pair of worldly dharmas, which is mentioned in this verse, is praise and blame. It's so easy for us to get caught in this one, isn't it? It's especially possible to get caught in it as a Dharma teacher. It's quite easy to end up just saying things that do not challenge ourselves or others in any way, since it might make someone uncomfortable. That's the usual phrase that we hear. We won't share that because it might make somebody uncomfortable. I actually think the real reason is that by choosing not to speak our truth, we don't have to be vulnerable. We can hide. The second pair of opposites is gain and loss. One of the most important aspects in terms of the spiritual life is to examine our motivation for practice. Is it to get something that we think we don't yet have? Insight, peace, liberation, happiness, and so forth, whatever it might be. Or is it to get rid of something? That's the other side. Sadness, anger, jealousy, depression, and so on. So using this lens of the 8 worldly dharmas, we see that while these motivations might have set us forth on this journey of discovery, in a lot of ways, they're very superficial. And as a practitioner, hopefully over time, we'll be able to let them go. We'll see them for what they are, this idea of gaining something or needing to lose something, whether in spiritual terms or in worldly terms, such as getting caught in the idea that we need to have more money, more possessions, more of something, more food, and being afraid of losing whatever we have already. And then there's status and disgrace, which are quite familiar for many of us. These 2 winds blow quite strongly for a number of us. And then there's pleasure and pain. Sometimes it's translated as bodily ease and pain, but pleasure and pain fits in a little more to the framework we're looking at this evening. We often have the idea that only pleasure is good, and that there's something wrong with pain. And so we build up this craving, this thirst for pleasure. And at the same time, along with that, we shut ourselves down and we build up an aversion to pain. Both are intrinsic parts of our human condition. They're both aspects of the way things are. There's pleasure, there's also pain. Take it from me. The 8 winds can be a great lens through which to reflect on our fixations, our fixed positions in every moment. The Buddha offered a very beautiful invitation for practice in order to help us to center ourselves when we notice these winds blowing in our heart. And this is a teaching that was offered to Rahula. You can find the text in the Middle Length Sayings, number 62. I shared about this text a number of months ago, but it feels important to share it again because it's a very powerful and very practical teaching on centering ourselves and recreating balance. So Rahula developed meditation in tune with the earth. For when you're developing meditation in tune with earth, agreeable and disagreeable impressions that have arisen will not control your mind. Just as people throw what is clean or unclean on the earth, At that moment, the earth is not horrified, humiliated, or disgusted by it. In the same way, when you're developing meditation in tune with the earth, agreeable and disagreeable impressions that have arisen will not control your mind. Develop meditation in tune with water. For when you're developing meditation in tune with water, agreeable and disagreeable impressions that have arisen will not control your mind. Just as when people wash what is clean or unclean in water, at that moment the water is not horrified, humiliated, or disgusted by it. In the same way, when you're developing meditation in tune with water, agreeable and disagreeable impressions that have arisen will not control your mind. Develop meditation in tune with fire. For when you are developing meditation in tune with fire, agreeable and disagreeable impressions that have arisen will not control your mind. Just as when fire burns what is clean or unclean, it is not horrified, humiliated, or disgusted by it. In the same way, when you're developing meditation in tune with fire, agreeable and disagreeable sensory impressions that have arisen will not stay in charge of your mind. Develop meditation in tune with wind. For when you're developing meditation in tune with wind, agreeable and disagreeable impressions that have arisen will not control your mind. Just as when the wind blows what is clean or unclean, at that moment it is not humiliated, horrified, or disgusted by it. In the same way, when you're developing meditation in tune with wind, agreeable and disagreeable impressions that have arisen will not stay in charge of your mind. And finally, develop meditation in tune with space. For when you're developing meditation in tune with space, agreeable and disagreeable impressions that have arisen will not control your mind. Just as space is not established anywhere, in the same way, when you're developing meditation in tune with space, agreeable and disagreeable impressions that have arisen will not control your mind. One of the things that I feel is important for us as practitioners to recognize is that insight is not static. Real insight is not frozen in time. Just like a flower, insight keeps opening to reveal different layers, just like the flower reveals different layers of petals. The fact that the journey of discovery is ongoing is wonderful. But it's also scary at the same time, because it means that at the heart of the spiritual life is a constant process of letting go, of leaving behind and moving on. In verse number 5, we read, "Even serious practitioners can quarrel like this, having ups and downs, elation and depression as they win and lose. Therefore, refrain from disputes. There's no meaning in it at all except the prize of praise." So let's face it, many serious practitioners do in fact quarrel like this, either with words or in conferences or in academic papers. And as we've said before, the world runs on praise and blame. Verse number 6, "If you make your point and win, and the group praises your ideas, you laugh and swell up with pride. That pride and arrogance will bring you down, but you're still arrogant, swollen with conceit. Don't you see that there's no point to dispute? The wise tell us that quarreling and purification don't mix." So why do the wise tell us that quarreling and purification, or quarreling and liberation, don't mix? basically because all views are wrong views. When we take up a position, a fixed position on anything, by very definition, we're only seeing something partially. And most often, let's face it, we're seeing it from the outside. Looking at this verse, those of you who participated in the Metta Sutta study class will recognize one word here that we see in English, puffed up or swollen. Here we have the image of someone who is swollen with arrogance and conceit. The Pali word for arrogance is mana. We're translating it here as conceit. And conceit in Buddhism is considered as one of the kleshas. Klesha is translated in many different ways, such as negative emotions, afflictions, defilements, poisons, and so on. And basically it refers to mental states arising from the three unhelpful roots in our consciousness, those three very deep roots: the root of greed, the root of ill will, aversion or hatred, and the root of delusion. These cloud our mind and heart, and they manifest outwardly as unhelpful actions of body, speech, and mind. Some great teachers have actually shared that the round of samsara, this round of unsatisfactoriness, flows onward due to these kleshas, due to these afflictive energies. So kleshas basically include states of mind such as hatred, fear, desire, loneliness, and so on. So as I'm sure you can imagine, the list of kleshas is quite extensive. Those of you who love lists can spend some time and research that. We don't have time to go into them this evening. We'll just touch upon the 5 key kleshas in the Mahayana tradition. The 5 kleshas consist of the 3 unwholesome roots that we just spoke about: greed, hatred, or ill will, and delusion, with 2 additional manifestations: pride and envy, or jealousy. So the first of the kleshas, the afflictive energies, is the root of ignorance, delusion, or confusion. And in Sanskrit, you will either see the word moha or avidya. In Pali, we'll see moha or avidya. It's almost the same word. And basically, this tendency towards delusion, it's very deep in our consciousness, basically means not seeing things clearly. A lack of discernment, maybe, or not understanding the way things are. The second of the 3 roots is attachment, desire, or passion, or thirst. In Sanskrit, it's raga, and in Pali, we'll see lopa. Basically, as a very simple framework, it means attachment or desire for what we like, what we find pleasant. The third root is aversion, hatred, or anger. In Sanskrit, we see vesha. In Pali, we see dosa. And it basically means aversion, a shutting down of the heart, which can be a really strong reaction, or it might be quite subtle, closing down our heart toward what we don't like, what we don't find pleasant, or toward that which prevents us from getting what we want. The fourth of the 5 kleshas described in the Mahayana tradition is pride, arrogance, or conceit. And that's the one that we're looking at in quite a bit of detail this evening. In Sanskrit and Pali, it's almost the same. It's mana. And it basically means having an inflated opinion of ourselves and a disrespectful or condescending attitude towards others. So in an earlier talk, we spoke of the 3 complexes of being greater than, being less than, or being equal. And these 3 complexes arise from this root, this conceit, this pride, or this arrogance. in the Atthakavagga, which is a commentary on the Abhidhamma, which was composed by Buddha Ghosha. Many of you will be familiar with Buddha Ghosha as the author, the attributed author of the Path of Purification, the Visuddhimagga. And in this other commentary that was composed by Buddha Ghosha on the Abhidhamma, he shares that conceit is fancying, vain imagining. It has haughtiness as a characteristic, self-praise as a function, desire as a banner and as a manifestation. And I found that to be quite a useful and helpful definition of conceit. Haughtiness as a characteristic, kind of being full of ourselves as a characteristic, self-praise as a function, desire to advertise ourself as a manifestation. So it functions to water the seed of not appreciating others or respecting and admiring the good qualities of others, or even on a more subtle level, to compare the qualities or accomplishments of others to ourselves, with ourselves as a reference point. For those of you who are list lovers, I'll give you a little hint. In the Mahayana tradition, there are 7 forms of conceit, 7 different forms of arrogance. There's a whole list, a whole subcategory of the different forms of arrogance. I know you'd like me to list them, and actually they're quite interesting to reflect on, but we don't have time to go into them this evening. I'll save it for another time. And then the final of the 5 kleshas in Mahayana Buddhism is envy or jealousy. In Sanskrit, it's irsya. In Pali, it's issa. Being unable to bear the accomplishments or good fortune of others. So if you've been looking deeply as we've been going through these kleshas, you'll see that the 4 immeasurable minds are wonderful antidotes for many of these tendencies towards conceit. Envy or jealousy, for example, empathetic joy, sympathetic joy, aversion, loving kindness, and so on. Equanimity is a wonderful antidote for attachment, and the list goes on. So the 4 immeasurable minds are very powerful tools for us to be able to identify areas of conceit within ourselves and also to be able to gradually transform them. Shall we continue on? So verse 8, just as a hero fed upon the best food might roar forth, running around searching for a champion, rival, and opponent, but discovering that there never was an opponent, when those holding onto rigid views and disputing proclaim, this is the only truth, just tell them that there never was anyone here to argue with. So here again, we have the insight that views develop from the basis of a self, from a position that's frozen in time. This doesn't mean becoming a pushover, but rather understanding from which position on a conscious level we're placing ourselves in any moment and not mistaking the position for insight. Verse number 9, Pasura, how could you find an opponent among those who have no opponents, who don't counter views with other views? Thinking about different ideas with your intellect has just confused you. Now you've met a wise one and you can't escape the truth. A while back, it might have been a couple of years ago, I saw a sign that was posted. It was like a poster. It was in New York City, and it said, "We're drowning in information while while thirsty for wisdom." And I felt that was an incredibly important teaching, that information is not the same as wisdom. And here again in this verse 9, we have this reminder to not mistake cognitive reasoning, intellect, ideas about this, that, and the other for insight. Insight is embodied wisdom welling up from within. And it doesn't always, although there's an intellectual aspect, it doesn't equate to just having information. Insight will always go together with transformation. So I'd like to offer as a reflection practice over these next few weeks, since there's so much in this beautiful poem that we could pull as reflection exercises, and something might have struck you, but I'd like to offer as a practice to reflect on the winds, the 8 winds, to see if we can identify whether we're caught in any of them at any particular moment in time. Or perhaps you might like to reflect on conceit and on the different positions that we hold. That beautiful, very short and pithy explanation of Buddhaghosa on conceit might be a helpful reflection to hold over the next couple of weeks, reflecting on the different positions that we hold and to reflect on why we might be holding those positions. It might also be helpful to remember as we go through these next couple of weeks that choosing to take no position is also a position. So we'll try not to get too caught in dualistic views. So dear beloved community, I hope that something has been of benefit for you this evening. It's certainly been a delight to be together with all of you. Thank you so much for your wholehearted practice. Let us come to a close with the sound of the bell.